Hello and welcome back to video number 2 in the Winning Agenda's Hero Spotlight series. My name's Jesse Marshall. Really excited to be back here. Thanks to all of you who gave us some feedback on the first video. First piece of feedback I got was, can you do Bravo next? So ask and you shall receive. Very happy to be doing Bravo Showstopper for our Hero Spotlight today. The other piece of feedback I received was that people were particularly interested in the budget builds aspect of these videos. Obviously, trying to target both at newer players, but also at more experienced players, intermediate players, I guess, who are looking to scope out the metagame and understand what it is that the heroes they might be coming up against are trying to do. Because one of the really important things in any metagame is you might have your deck and you might be really confident about your game plan, but you've also got to understand what your opponents might be trying to do, what their weak points are, and what their strengths are. So I hope that for beginners and intermediate players alike, and even for those experienced players who might be less familiar with one or two classes, this series might give you a little bit more insight into what the wide variety of heroes in the game are all trying to do. So, the budget builds aspect though, I didn't touch on that. One of the requests we got was, could we put a budget deck list alongside each of our videos? So you'll see in the video description, we've got a budget deck list from FabDB. Thanks to the wonderful people at FabDB who run that website. It's extremely useful. Having any card database that allows you to do deck building is central to any card game success. So thanks to the team at FabDB for that. But anyway, let's dive straight in without any further ado. So Bravo's hero ability is really, really important and central to the way the deck functions. It's not something that you use every turn, but the threat of Bravo's ability, which is an action, it costs 2 resources, and it says until end of turn, your attack action cards with cost 3 or greater, so your expensive attack action cards, have dominate. Go again. So what that means is, you can see in the brackets, the defending hero can't defend the attack with more than 1 card from their hand. So as I was saying, the threat of that is actually just really important because your opponents have to do things like have defense reactions in their deck that they can put into arsenal to stave off your big attacks. Because even if they have defense reactions in hand or cards in hand, they can only block with one of them, and it's only defense reactions that can block from arsenal. So getting those into arsenal is really important for your opponent so that they can block with multiple cards on your big attacks that you give dominate with your hero ability. And just in general, the ability to give dominate, it's a really powerful keyword in Flesh and Blood, because a lot of decks will try and use their entire hand to block or multiple cards from their hand to block. You know, it's one of the ways that you can control tempo. So taking that option away from your opponent is really, really powerful. So having that threat there is really good and really important. And as you can see, and as you'll see throughout the rest of the video, these are a couple of the Majestics from Welcome to Rathe, which is the first set. And these were Bravo's 2 big Crush attacks. And what they show you, I've just got them here. I'll talk a bit more about Crush as one of the sort of important keyword elements of Bravo a little bit later on. But what you can see from these attacks is they're very expensive. They cost 7 and 5. They've got this keyword ability, Crush, which is an on-hit trigger that you not only have to hit, but you have to deal 4 or more damage. So you have to hit them quite hard in order for Crush to do its thing. And they have really high attacks. So Crippling Crush at 11 is a massive attack. Spinal Crush at 9 is huge. And you can see immediately the synergy with Bravo's hero ability. If you can give a Crippling Crush dominate and your opponent can only block with 1 card, the chance of you getting off that Crush ability is really high. And same with Spinal Crush. So Bravo's hero ability, combining it with Crush, taking advantage of the fact that you've got a dominate inbuilt on the board all the time, that's really core to Bravo. So the first thing that you'll obviously notice is that Bravo's ability costs 2. Crippling Crush and Spinal Crush and all the other Crush attacks cost quite a lot of resources. And as we know in Flesh and Blood, the maximum amount of resources that a card pitches for is 3. So when you're already taking 2 from your hero ability and maybe 5, 7, even more to play your attacks, you need a lot of resources going on. So one way that you can help manage that is the legendary chess piece equipment from Welcome to Rathe, the Guardian piece, which is Tectonic Plating. And it's got this ability that says, once per turn action, spend 1 resource, create a Seismic Surge token, go again. It's also got 2 defense and Battle Worn, which is, you know, the kind of peak for equipment power at the moment. Means you can block for 2 and block for 1, so 3 total, and the equipment stays on the board. So it's a really powerful piece of equipment in the vein of those other battle-worn 2 equipments that exist. But what does a Seismic Surge token actually do? What it says is, at the beginning of your action phase, destroy Seismic Surge, and the next Guardian attack action card you play this turn costs 1 less to play. So you can see immediately the play pattern that Bravo, the Crush cards, and Tectonic Plating is suggesting to you is that if you can plan not to attack every turn with a big Crush attack, but to do a little bit of setup, then Tectonic Plating can help you to bring the cost of your Crush attack down from, say, 7, which is very difficult, to 6, because 7 is 3 cards worth of resources, whereas 6 is only 2. So it's those really important little breakpoints, if you like. We talk about breakpoints in terms of attacks, but for Bravo, a lot of it is about breakpoints in terms of resources and what you can conceivably do on one turn. So Tectonic Plating is an important piece. Then you've also got other resources, because obviously resources in and of themselves are good. Resource cost reductions are good from Seismic Surges, but having more cards in hand is also a resource, because the more cards in hand you have, the more things you can pitch, and the more options you have, obviously, as well. So cards like Stamp Authority, which is an aura, and you'll see as we go through that Guardian has a number of auras that you often play, and they go away at the beginning of your next turn. So they play very similarly to this Seismic Surge idea, where you're taking turns off to do a bit of setup, and then having a big turn. Taking a bit of turn off to set up, then having a big turn. That's kind of more of the play pattern of Guardian, whereas in that first video when we were talking about Dorinthia, a lot of it was just about getting your foot on the throat, keeping it on there, and just pounding. For Guardian, a lot of it's about taking a couple of hits, maybe absorbing with some defense reactions and some defensive cards and some equipment, and then coming back with something really hard and trying to disable your opponent a little bit, using your Crush effects, which we'll come to in a minute. So Stamp Authority is a great example of something that on your off turn, you can play the Stamp Authority, get it on the battlefield, and when it's on the arena, if you have 2 or more cards in your pitch zone with cost 3 or greater, your hero gains +1 intellect till end of turn. So you can pitch a blue to play Stamp Authority. You can pitch another blue to, say, attack with your hammer, which we'll come to in a minute as well. Your hero gets +1 intellect, so at the end of that turn, you're drawing up to 5. And while it's in the arena, attack action card effects don't trigger when they hit. So your opponent's attacks on you will be hopefully a bit less impactful as well. And then on your next turn, the Stamp Authority goes away. But for a turn, you've got an extra card, and you've hopefully defanged your opponent's attacks a little bit. So Anothos is the weapon that came with Bravo in Welcome to Rathe. It costs 3 to attack, so it's quite expensive. But it's really efficient because it says 3 attack, 4 damage. That's not so efficient. But the bonus is if you have 2 or more cards in your pitch zone with cost 3 or greater, Anothos gains +2 strength. So this can be a 3 cost, 6 power attack on a weapon, which is pretty good. And all it asks of you is to have basically 2 cards with cost 3 or greater. So it's not pitch value. So they can be reds or yellows or blues, but they have to have cost 3 or greater in your pitch zone. And as you've seen already, all the Crush cards that I've shown you, plus the Stamp Authority, have quite high costs. And the deck is full of those sorts of cards. So it's really not hard to fulfill Anothos' trigger condition. Basically, as long as you've got 2 cards in your pitch zone, most of the time, it's going to be attacking for 6. And Anothos is a really important piece because when you're playing this kind of turn on, turn off game, so one turn is your big turn and then the next turn is not such a big turn, Anothos allows you to still be hitting for 6 on your off turns. And that's really important because you can't take your foot off the pedal entirely. You can't allow your opponent to get away with just fully recharging on their turn and not putting any pressure. And Anothos attacking for 6 is still a reasonable amount of pressure on those off turns. But having other cards like Stamp Authority or Blessing of Deliverance, which we'll come to in a minute, on those setup turns and just being able to activate your Tectonic Plating means that you can then have a huge turn the turn after. So making sure that you incorporate Anothos into your plan and allow it to give you the opportunity to keep up some pressure on your off turns is very, very important in Bravo. So we've talked about the sort of how to manage and how to set up, how to get the resources to do what you want to do, but what actually is it that you want to be doing on these Crush turns? I should mention as well, having these Crush attacks is one way to play Bravo. The other way is entirely defensive, which we'll come to in a minute. Sometimes you try and do a mix of both. And I personally enjoy having the option to do both. even in a matchup where I think my opponent's going to be the aggressor. I like being able to put a bit of pressure back on them with effects like Crush Confidence. So this is a great example of a crush effect that can be really impactful. The blue version, is a 3 for 5. If it deals 4 or more damage to the hero, they lose all hero card effects and activated abilities until the end of their next turn. It's worth noting that this just straight up kills Leviathan most of the time in the late game. So if you attack a Leviathan and you manage to get the crush effect off, they can't erase their blood debt anymore for the following turn because they lose Levi's ability, so they pretty much die. It's quite good against Chain. It turns off them being able to get go again on a key turn, which is massive. And it's good against a range of other heroes as well, many of whom rely on their hero abilities. Even think about Bolton, not being able to give things go again, not being able to buff after charging. All of these things are quite impactful. And Crush Confidence, even though you might look at it and say, well, it's a 3-cost attack, it only hits for 5, they only have to block 2 in order to turn off the Crush. Like, that's one card, what's the big deal? The main thing about these is not necessarily that you're going to crush with them every time you hit with them. Although obviously that's great if you can activate Bravo and have other things to make them stronger, or maybe just your opponent doesn't block for some reason. If you can be hitting with them all the time, that's great. But it's the threat of what happens if you hit with them, forcing your opponent to block, that can also be just as important, because that obviously takes power away from their next turn. And that's one of the things in Flesh and Blood that's really important, is not just thinking about what damage can I do to my opponent and how can I kill them, but also how can I take resources and cards away from them on my turn so that they can't hit me back as hard. And Bravo is really a lot about that. It's not just about how can I hit them as hard and hard and hard as possible every single turn. A lot of it is about how can I stay alive, protect myself, still hit them a bit, but be threatening them so much with the things that I am hitting them with that they have to pretty much exhaust themselves in the process of defending. We'll come to exhaustion a bit more in a moment, but that's just an example. So Cartilage Crush, another crush effect. If it deals 4 or more damage, the first action they play in their next turn costs an additional 1. Again, it's not game breaking. You're not going to win the game just by landing a Cartilage Crush, but you are going to disrupt their next turn. You're either saying to them, you can disrupt your turn by committing a card to block here, which means you have fewer resources available, or if you try and preserve your resources in hand and say, yeah, sure, let it hit me, then you have to pay a bit more anyway. And that's where the power of these crush cards comes in. Debilitate's another example. If they try and hold all their cards in hand so they can hit you as hard as possible, well, Debilitate's going to take a bit of damage off their first attack. Mangle is an example of a crush card with some extremely gruesome art that allows you to get a bit more of an advantage on the board. So again, if they don't want to commit, basically, Mangle's hitting them for 8, so you only need to get 4 through. So if they don't block with 2 cards at least, remembering, of course, that you can use Bravo's ability in combination with Mangle for 6 resources total, which is pitching 2 blues, to have an 8 damage dominated attack. That's really powerful. But assuming that you haven't dominated it, and it's just coming in for 8, you can just present them with this conundrum where they go, well, if I let it crush me, I'm going to lose one of my equipment, which could be really important. It could be a Guardian Mirror match, and it could be their tectonic plating that they've blocked with once. And all of a sudden it's like, well, if I lose my tectonic plating, what impact's that going to have on me for the rest of the game? So maybe I should block with more cards. And then their following turn is weaker. So Mangle is a great example of a crush card that can present some really important long-term advantage for you if your opponent doesn't respect the crush. Spinal Crush is another one. If it deals 4 or more damage, this is one of the aforementioned Majestics from Welcome to Rathe. Action cards, activated abilities, and attacks they control lose and can't gain go again. So basically, they can't, if they're Katsu, they can't string together a combo. If they're Chain, they only get to do 1 attack or play 1 action card. It's basically preventing those. You can see in the art that the Guardian has a ninja over its knee, and that's exactly what this is about. Stopping those ninjas, those rune blades, shadow rune blades, even Bolton and those warrior decks, light warriors that are attempting to go wide, or Prism attempting to have multiple attacks, not if you get hit by a Spinal Crush. So a Spinal Crush on a key turn, if you can set it up and make sure that you're going to be crushing them, you can actually crush their whole next turn, which can be really huge. Crippling Crush is another example. Discarding 2 random cards if it crushes is huge. And yes, it's expensive, but it hits for 11, which is not only going to impact significantly on their life total, but also on their next turn if you can get the crush effect off. Chokeslam is another one. Attack action cards they control can't gain strength. Might seem a bit niche, but very important for decks that are looking to buff their own attacks. Things like Shadow Runeblade Chain, looking to buff Riftbinds, looking to use things like Howl from Beyond, things like Shadow Puppetry even to give little buffs here and there. Chokeslam can shut that down a bit. And it's just another example of a card with Crush that demands a block, otherwise it's going to weaken your opponent's turn, just playing into that overall theme. Another thing to note about Chokeslam and Mangle being cards that cost 4 and debilitate even, though it's a far less powerful example, so good with tectonic plating. You know, if you can reduce that cost from 4 to 3 with Crippling Crush, if you can reduce it from 7 to 6, it's taking it from 2 cards worth of resources to 1. So really, really important. Disable is another one. Put a card from their arsenal on the bottom of their deck. So it's a little bit like a Command and Conquer of sorts. Although it can be blocked by defense reactions, so it's not quite as good as Command and Conquer. And Crush the Weak. They can't play attack action cards with 3 or less base strength during the next action phase. So really good against decks that are trying to go wide on you with a whole lot of little attacks. They can't do it if they're attack action cards. So attack buffs, speaking of gruesome art, these are things that can let you get off your Crush attacks, because obviously you've got Bravo's ability to dominate that can help you do it, but the attack buffs in Towering Titan and Pummel, these are 2 just kind of commonly played examples, can fulfill very different roles in helping you to increase the strength of your attacks such that your opponent can't prevent the Crush. So Towering Titan says, at the beginning of your action phase, destroy Towering Titan, and the next Guardian attack action you play this turn gains +8 strength. So you play this on your setup turn, it costs 9, so it probably costs you a whole hand to go pitch 3 blues and Towering Titan, but then the next turn, you know you're going to be hitting them for 8 additional damage, which if you put that on a Crippling Crush, you know, it's going up to 19. That's pretty hard to block. So yeah, Towering Titan is an option to have in your deck if you want to be able to have a setup turn at some point and then try and land that final Crush to either kill your opponent or significantly debilitate and hamper their next turn. Pummel is something that your opponents are going to have to respect as a threat at kind of instant speed or reaction speed. It costs 2, and the red version says choose 1, target club or hammer weapon attack gains +4 strength, so you can play it on Anothos. It also says target attack action card with cost 2 or greater, so that's going to be all your Crush attacks, gain +4 strength, and if this hits a hero, they discard a card. So not only does it help you get your Crush off, because it's 4 additional strength, so if they block exactly the amount of your attack, you then add 4, which means the Crush effect happens, but you also get to make them discard a card. So Pummel's just like a really perfect pairing with Bravo, and really perfectly paired with the Crush attacks. And even the blue, which only buffs for 2, can be really helpful, because you'll often see a play pattern against Guardian where you might block such that only 2 or 3 damage goes through, so the Crush effect doesn't happen. Well, a blue Pummel can still get you over to Crush, but also give you the discard effect. So that's really powerful. Life gain. So I mentioned earlier that you can theme your deck around the Crush attacks and trying to really sort of pound your opponent turn after turn, or you can, on your setup turns, where you're doing things like hitting your tectonic plating to get a seismic surge, or playing a Stamp Authority, you can do things like play Blessing of Deliverance as well. And Blessing of Deliverance is a great one because it gains you some life on the following turn, and it replaces itself on the turn that you play it. The fact that it replaces itself also helps to fuel your Anothos, because the more cards you have in hand, so if you pitch a blue to play Blessing of Deliverance, then you draw a card when it comes into play, because you have a card with cost 3 or greater in your pitch zone, because it's a Crush attack. You draw a card, and then you can pitch another one to attack with your Anothos. And for 2 cards, the card you pitched to play the Blessing and the Blessing itself, you've pitched 2 cards, the one you pitched to play the Blessing, and then the one you drew off the Blessing, which you pitched to attack with Anothos, so you've fulfilled Anothos's condition as well. So that can be like a turn where you've blocked with a card and then played a defense reaction like Sink Below, so you've only got 2 cards left in hand at the start of your turn. You can still be presenting a relevant effect in the Blessing and an Anothos attack for 6. and that's really powerful. So Blessing's a really good card. It enables some good play patterns, and it also enables you to gain life, which is something rare in Flesh and Blood, but something really important if you are looking to outlast your opponent and get them with a small number of really big attacks. It just allows you to smooth and control the tempo of the game a bit better. Sigil of Solace is another great way to gain life. The red one, it's an instant, and it just lets you play it to gain 3. And what that means is that early on, if your opponent perhaps isn't threatening you too much, or if you're able to successfully block out their attacks with the other cards in your hand, you can actually turn what would have been maybe an arsenal card or an extra card in hand, and not a particularly effective one at coming back at your opponent, into 3 life. And then, of course, you draw up at the end of your turn to replace it anyway. And that can allow you on a turn cycle to actually end up blocking out all your opponent's attacks and actually ending up on a higher life, which can be more important and more impactful than perhaps just swinging with Anothos for 4 if you had 1 card left in hand. So Sigil of Solace can be a really powerful effect to let you elongate the game and again get to a point where you can finish them off with one of your big dominate attacks. Heart of Fyendal, obviously it's a hard card to come by, but if you do happen to have one of the Fableds from the first set, it can be really nice too. When you pitch it, if you got less life than your opponent, you can gain a life. And it's a blue, which fits obviously perfectly into everything that we're trying to do. Defense reactions are another way to try and elongate the game a bit. Unmovable is a really powerful, strong defense reaction. If it's played from Arsenal, even the blue one defense for 6, which is huge. It's quite expensive, but since the deck is going to be full of blues, it kind of doesn't really matter. Any cost between 1 and 3 for a defense reaction is pretty much the same to Bravo, once your deck has this huge density of blues in it. So playing unmovables can be really nice, but you've also got other options like Sink Below, cost 0, so it's just 1 card to block, and it blocks for 4. And I thought I had Fate Foreseen there, but Fate Foreseen is the same as Sink Below, but it has a slightly different effect when you play it. But it's a 0 for 4. Defense reaction, and yeah, at red, and those are the ones that you want to play. Equipment is the last piece of the puzzle. Arcanite Skullcap, which we talked about for Dorinthia, is also really good. In Bravo, you want to be defending. You do have a couple of other budget options that we'll come to in a minute, but having the 3 blocks effectively, because at some point in the game you're probably likely to go lower than in life than your opponent, so 3 life points of block is just really good. And at the moment, there's nothing better. Tectonic Plating, we've already talked about. Crater Fist is a Majestic from Crucible of War, which is now more available, yay. It's got an action, pay 3, destroy Crater Fist. Your attacks with Crush gain +2 strength this turn, go again, and it's got Temper. So you can block once for 2, but then if you choose to block once again for 1, it actually dies. That's fine. Blocking for 3 total, again, a really strong piece of equipment. So if you look at all 3 of these, you've actually got 9 block worth of equipment there, which is really strong across the course of the game. Or you can use Crater Fist as more of an offensive card on a key turn to try and give one of your Crush attacks +2. Iron Rot Legs is kind of the best legs at the moment for Guardian. We might see some more in Tales of Aria. But there are Iron Rot Legs or there's Null Rune Boots. It's pretty basic on the boots side of things. The other option is to play Mage Master Boots and 1 Tome of Fyendal in your deck, which I actually really like as well. That's a combination because it means it's a good combination because it means that you've got the Mage Master Boots on the board from the start. On the turn, whenever it is that you draw your Tome of Fyendal, you just Arsenal the Tome, and then the following turn you get to have a free Tome, gain some life, get some extra cards sort of situation. So given that Null Rune, if you don't need the Null Rune Boots, I would probably go the Mage Master Boots and Tome combo for the boot slot. Budget options, you've got Helm of Isen's Peak, which is a Battle Worn 1 equipment, common from Welcome to Rathe. It's got an ability to, on one of your off turns, if you don't attack with Anothos, instead you can just draw up 1 extra card. So you could play a Blessing of Deliverance and then crack your Helm of Isen's Peak at some point in the mid game and have a 5-card hand for the following turn, which can be nice. Heart and Cross Strap, if you can't use Tech Plating, which really, really recommend you get a Tech Plating if you're going to play Guardian, but if you can't, it's still fine, it's still fun, and the budget deck is still actually pretty good. Heart and Cross Strap can help you pay for one of your Spinal Crushes or Crippling Crushes or one of those things on a key turn. Goliath Gauntlet does a pretty good impression of Crater Fist. It's got that same buff one of your attacks for +2, it just doesn't have the block ability. And then you've got the Null Rune Boots and the Iron Rod as well in the foot slot, all of which are commons. So you've got this common equipment suite. It's okay. It doesn't give you the same kind of fridge-like armor ability that you get from those legendaries, which had 9 points of block in the first 3 slots. This one, you've only got 1 for this common version, so that's quite different. But you can still make it work, and the deck still functions pretty well. It just means that your defense won't quite be as strong as if you had those legendaries. There are a range of things. I mentioned Tome of Fyendal. There's Showtime, which is one of the other Bravo specializations. There's Snag, which is a great sideboard card against Chain, and it's also a blue. You've got Rouse the Ancients, which is another great way to try and reward yourself for having heaps of Crush effects in your deck. If you go for a more aggressive Crush-style deck, Rouse the Ancients is a really good one to consider. And then you've got Zealous Belting. So those two in the bottom right, Rouse the Ancients and Zealous Belting, are both cards that can give you Go Again, so allow you to get 2 attacks in 1 turn when you're going for one of your big Crush turns. So they're definitely worth considering. So in summary, balance your big Crush attacks and your resources in your deck construction. Make sure you haven't got too much of one and not enough of the other. Don't play too many reds. Think about playing the blue Crush attacks if you can. Even though the reds feel more powerful, you really need blues in your deck. So make sure you're balancing and you've got the right number of resources. Build to your key Crush turns with Dominate when you're playing. Be aware of what your opponent's trying to do and use the Crush effects in your deck that are going to be most impactful against them, which also means you probably want to have a good smorgasbord in your deck to choose from, so that you can select the right option and the right Crush attack to properly debilitate and destabilize your opponent on their turn. Sideboard to either disrupt, again, keeping in mind what your opponent's game plan is and how best you can disrupt them with the most impactful and timely Crush attacks, or outlast them. Bring in more defense reactions, more sigils, and just try and sit there, outlast them, and perhaps get in a couple of key blows to weaken their key turns and hope that you can exhaust them. That's definitely a strategy that Bravo can try. So I hope you've enjoyed. That's the Bravo Hero Spotlight. If you're enjoying the series, please let me know. We'll be back with more videos. Let us know which heroes you'd like us to do next. And don't forget to like and subscribe to support the channel. Thanks very much.